Welcome to the fourth episode of Zoroastrianism 101, a series in which we'll be exploring the culture, traditions, histories, mythologies, philosophies, theologies, and more of one of the world's oldest and most influential continuously practiced religions in the world. You don't have to watch our series in order, but if you go back to previous episodes, you may find more detail on certain concepts and terminologies that are being talked about in this episode. In this episode, we'll be exploring the history of Zoroastrianism after Zarathustra, with the rise of the three great Persian empires and the Alexandrian interregnum, with the history that develops after the Islamic invasion of Persia, and thus one of the most cataclysmic moments in Zoroastrian history. We'll talk about Zoroastrianism in development in the diaspora to India, China, and other places as well, and how the Zoroastrian community in Iran persevered and developed under various and many years of oppression. So please join us in this episode of Zoroastrianism 101.
Zoroastrianism's history after Zarathustra is a bit tricky to materialize until the Achaemenid Empire, the first of the three great Persian Zoroastrian dynasties, and the start of classical Zoroastrianism. What we know comes from the post-Zarathustra Young Avestan texts, which display a familiarity with only a specific part of the Iranic world. In the words of Dr. Prod's Oktor Skjaervø, the fact that the oldest Young Avestan texts apparently contain no reference to Western Iran, including Media, would seem to indicate that they were composed in Eastern Iran before the Median domination reached the area. The semi-trustworthy Herodotus tells us that classical Zoroastrians, led by the Median Magi priestly caste, worshipped at the top of high hills and mountains. He also notes that they exposed the dead to the elements, conducted sacrifices where they recited hymns in honor of the gods, and prized truth highly. However, Zoroastrian history remained relatively dormant until the reign of Cyrus the Great, who, as leader of the Western Iranic Median vassal state of Persis, overthrew the vast Median Empire and created an empire that stretched from the western coasts of Anatolia to the eastern borders of modern-day Pakistan. Our clues to Cyrus's Zoroastrian faith are in the names of his family members, such as Vishtaspa, father of Darius the Great, and Hutaosa. These are references to the Kavi and his queen that sponsored Zarathustra, which shows that even if Cyrus wasn't Zoroastrian, then at least his family was. Dr. Almut Hinze gives more details on what else we know about Zoroastrianism under the Achaemenids.
We know that they worshipped Ahura Mazda. That's very clear from the Old Persian inscriptions. We know that they were committed to Asha and that they hated the Druj. And that the Druj is the lie, which is another expression for the destructive force of Angra Mainyu. So that's evil for the Zoroastrians. Of course, in the inscriptions which we have, the Druj is equated with the king's opponent. So it's politicized there. We have, unfortunately, very few sources about the Zoroastrian religion during the Achaemenid period. It must have been there, otherwise it would not have continued. There must have been continuity. The religion was certainly very strong in eastern Iran. We know that from the Avesta, especially in Sistan. Sistan plays a major role in the Avesta, and that's pre-Achaemenid. So the Zoroastrian religion was around in Iran and has been there before the Achaemenids came to power. And they use it for their propaganda, and they promote it. We have the Xerxes' Diva inscription in which he prides himself of having razed to the ground a diver sanctuary where divers were worshipped. Unfortunately, he doesn't say where. We would like to know where it was. But he says so. So divers were worshipped, and he replaced the cult of the divers with the cult of Ahura Mazda.
Furthermore, in an inscription at Susa, Artaxerxes II named the Jatas Mithra and Anahita, his patrons, alongside Ahura Mazda, and built temples dedicated to them. He also instituted a calendar reform, renaming the days and months for Zoroastrian divinities. The Achaemenids and their stage of classical Zoroastrianism would end with the arrival of one of the most controversial figures in Zoroastrian history, Alexander of Macedon, who, while known to many as the Great, is remembered in Zoroastrianism primarily as the Accursed. Alexander greatly admired Cyrus. Seeking to outdo him, he conquered the Persian Empire and, according to Zoroastrian legends, burnt down many temples, libraries, and shrines, destroying many Zoroastrian scriptures in the process. While these claims remain historically unsubstantiated, they have nonetheless influenced Zoroastrian perceptions of Alexander, with only a few taking the Shahnameh's position, presenting him as a heroic and legitimate ruler. Under Alexander's empire and that of his Seleucid successors, imperial officials left Zoroastrianism relatively undisturbed. Thus, localized and syncretic forms of Zoroastrianism flourished during this time, including Helleno-Zoroastrianism practiced in the Greco-Iranian kingdom of Commagene, and localized Zoroastrianisms developed in Cappadocia, Armenia, Sogdia, the Kushan Empire, and elsewhere. Otherwise, we know little about their interactions with Zoroastrianism, besides that their policies of religious non-intervention were continued by the second great Persian dynasty, the Parthians, who engaged in active syncretism between their sponsored forms of Zoroastrianism and various spiritual traditions. Most notable amongst the Parthian rulers was Vologases I, mentioned in the Denkard, a Middle Persian Zoroastrian text, who sponsored the Magi and attempted to recompile the supposedly lost Avestan corpus.
What can be said about Zoroastrianism under the Parthians?
Again, our sources are a big problem. We would love to know more about it. The picture which generally emerges, and the picture which the Sasanians later project back on the Parthians, is that there was greater diversity of local practices, and that there were lots of local regnal fires, that there were many local kings and each of them had their own regnal fire. And presumably there were variations of the Zoroastrian religion, also in the rituals, how they performed the rituals, and probably also dialectal influences on the pronunciation of the Avesta from different areas. And the Zoroastrian religion must have been, again, practiced everywhere, among other religions probably. So it was not only uniformly Zoroastrian, there were also other religions, especially under Christianity started under the in the Achaemenid, in the Parthian period, and there were growing Christian communities in Iran, and they seem to have been okay and flourishing. Only the Zoroastrian priests, and later we know that from the Sasanian period, they started to worry when too many Zoroastrians converted to Christianity. Zoroastrian religion was also strong in Asia Minor, Cappadocia, for example, we have reports, and then also in eastern Iran. There were Zoroastrianism was practiced all over Asia Minor, in the Iranian heartlands that included Mesopotamia, and then also in Central Asia.
Zoroastrianism in Persian imperial history would not further develop until the arrival of the third and last of the great Persian dynasties, the Sassanids, who overthrew the Parthians and claimed to be the pious and blessed descendants of a magus called Sasan, hence the dynastic name. This final chapter of classical Zoroastrianism saw an altar and throne Zoroastrianism develop from Ardashir I, the first Sassanid Shah, where religious authority was increasingly centralized on the ruler and his chosen high priests. Zoroastrianism was not just made official, but directly conflicted with many other faiths in the empire, including Christianity, which was viewed as being too connected to Rome, their imperial rivals. This aggressive sponsorship simultaneously led to a staggering amount of temples, shrines, monuments, literature, liturgy, and grand inscriptions being created, but also led to the catastrophic collapse of Zoroastrianism with the fall of the last Sasanian Shah, Yazdegerd III. Most of our records regarding classical Zoroastrianism come from this period, and as this is a 101, we sadly can't cover it all. Thankfully, we can once again ask Dr. Hintze to provide her insight.
Well, some scholars refer to this as classical Zoroastrianism. It's, of course, the latest period where Zoroastrianism was a state religion, an official religion. And we have the greatest amount of sources from that period. And the tradition is only the tradition of the province of Pars. That's why Middle Persian is the language which is the vehicle for the Zoroastrian tradition as it has come down to the present day. And of course that was also the province of Pars was a province where the Sasanians had come from, the Sasanian dynasty, just as it was the home province of the Achaemenid kings. And so from that period we have inscriptions and we have some Zoroastrian texts. However, they all come from the early Islamic period already, but they are in Middle Persian language. The image which we get was that the Zoroastrian religion was firmly established, that the priesthood was hierarchically structured. The structure of the priesthood imitated the structure of the kingship, with the king of kings at the top and the priest of priests at the top of the priesthood. And then there was an army of priests hierarchically organized below that chief priest, and we know a number of names of those chief priests. One of the most prominent chief priests was Khosrow, who had a very long life, and he was the chief priest under 7 Sasanian kings, and he was extremely powerful and very, very influential. We even have inscriptions from him where he writes about a religious experience that is the Khirdeh's vision of what happens after death and an otherworldly journey. So that's a very important religious document directly from the Sasanian period, an inscription. So not a political inscription, but a religious inscription. But of course, the religion in those days, it was also political. These priests had an enormous power, and they really had a grip on people's minds and controlled the population from the way they should, from their mindset. It was very, very well structured, and each person was supposed to have a ratu, a guide, spiritual guide, and the priests were also the judges. So the law, it was a Zoroastrian law, which was regulated and implemented by the priesthood. So they were the religious leaders and they were the legal experts in Sasanian society alongside the king. And the king consulted them on a lot of political questions as well. They had a very great influence in the state.
A large part of Zoroastrianism's long existence is primarily due to its constant adaptability, flexibility, and willingness to account for an ever-changing world. However, No event has been as impactful and cataclysmic as the Islamic invasion of Persia in the 7th century CE. Late classical Zoroastrianism, so married to the Sasanian throne as it was, collapsed in massive ways that are sometimes challenging to comprehend. Imagine being the world's dominant religion, yet in less than a couple of centuries it becomes a footnote, a matter for strange and inquisitive YouTubers to watch carefully crafted 20-minute videos about. In any case, let's dive into this a bit and see what our friend Dr. Hintze can once again tell us about this moment that changed Zoroastrianism forever.
The invasion of the Arabs and the fall of the Sasanian state was traumatic for the Zoroastrians. The invasion of Iran meant a huge amount of wealth for the invaders. And one of their prime targets were the Zoroastrian fire temples, because the Zoroastrian fire temples were not only places of worship at all, they were also places of riches. They were guardians of endowments which members of the community had made to the fire temples to ensure the continued performance of rituals on behalf of the deceased. And they were depositories for wealth, also in terms of valuables, material valuables, but also lands which belonged to the fire temples. The invaders, they seized all of that, and it was almost like a snowball system that started to operate, and they acquired all these riches, and then they continued invading Iran and got lots of material assets, and Iran then came under their rule, but Zoroastrianism continued to be strong, although they had lost power and material wealth. They continued to practice their religion, their ancestral religion, for many, many centuries. We think about until the invasion of the Turks in the 11th century and then the Mongols in the 13th century. Until then, Zoroastrianism was going strong. But the priesthood had lost its Sasanian organization because the temporal power had collapsed. There was no longer a king of kings, and so the priest of priests also lost his position with it. So with the Sasanian organization of the state, also the structure of the priesthood collapsed, and then the chief priest was no longer the priest of priests, but he became the Hudinan Peshobai, the leader of those of the good religion. And they still had a figurehead, a leader, then he still was able to provide guidance. But then after the invasions of the Turks and the Mongols, then the Zoroastrians withdrew to the desert towns, and their numbers were decimated then more and more for a number of reasons. It was obviously disadvantageous not to be a Muslim, and gradually Zoroastrians converted, also enticed by certain inheritance laws. So if one member of the family converted to Islam, that person would inherit the whole property, everything, and the others would have nothing. And that happened. And then, of course, the marriage laws. If anybody intermarried with a Muslim, then the family had to be Muslim. And it was always disadvantageous in society, as it is to the present day, not to be a Muslim in a Muslim state.
This post-invasion period saw the global Zoroastrian population drastically dwindle as Zoroastrian dynasties toppled and mass conversion events occurred over the next few centuries. Some governments and populations became Christian, such as in Armenia. Many others became Muslim, and some even rose to syncretic movements like the Kuramites, who waged sacred rebellion against their new rulers. While Zoroastrians remained in the Iranic world, a good number of priestly families claimed to have fled by sea during this time to modern Gujarat, thus giving birth to the unique, influential, and ethnocentric Parsi community of India. The Sasanian nobility fled mostly to western China, where a Zoroastrian Taoist hybrid developed that remained in rural Chinese communities until the Cultural Revolution. With this massive cataclysm unfolding and Zoroastrianism mostly shattered, existing more and more as small pockets throughout the region, the pre-modern period of Zoroastrianism had begun. This period of Zoroastrian history, from 700 CE to the 1700s CE, saw fewer developments on the grand political and social scale, and was more of a literary renaissance, with many important theological and storytelling texts produced at this time. This includes mythological narratives such as the Zardosht-Nameh, the Bundahisn, and Arda Wiraf, and theological exegesis like the Denkard, the Rivayats, and the Dadestan-i Denig, and many more. These texts are still engaged with in some form or another by Zoroastrians today, and have become an invaluable resource for understanding the beliefs and practices of Zoroastrians in the pre-modern period. As to the particularities of these texts, well, you'll have to wait for the next episode for that exploration, so don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. During this time, throughout the Iranic world, Zoroastrian sites were being rebuilt or destroyed by the new Muslim and Christian rulers, alongside with texts, relics, sacred fires, artwork, and more, thus eliminating vast amounts of Zoroastrian material history. Zoroastrians who remained in the Iranic world in this time either fought back militarily in various resistance movements, engaged in constant debates and apologia relating to new faiths surrounding them, or moved deeper into the deserts around Yazd and Kerman, where they were not as threatened. Zoroastrianism thus became a strongly rural religion, deep in the hinterlands of both the Iranic world and Gujarat, in what would become modern India. While communication existed between the two communities as seen in the Rivayats, very little travel occurred, and these two communities, amongst others, were mostly isolated during the pre-modern era until the arrival of the British Empire in India, and thus the beginning of the modern Zoroastrian era. The Parsis benefited significantly from British colonization and imperialism, leveraging their early adoption of British education, English language proficiency, and commercial acumen to secure prominent roles in colonial society, and thus present themselves as a model colonial minority. Moving thus from being rural farmers to urban merchants, they positioned themselves as intermediaries between the British and local Indian populations, particularly in the realms of trade, industry, and law, and involved themselves in crucial British trade routes. This led to the emergence of prominent Parsi industrialists, such as the Tata and Wadia families, which still have a massive influence on the Indian economy. Additionally, the British preference for loyal and westernized collaborators afforded the Parsis opportunities for upward mobility, philanthropy, and civic leadership. This helped them punch far above their demographic weight in Bombay's urban and economic development, providing them positions in the British Parliament, sitting the benches from various political movements. Thus, the Parsis entered a golden age of sorts, where, once again, they benefited from the patronage of a large empire. Parsis, with their newfound wealth and power, played a crucial role in ameliorating the harsh conditions faced by their fellow Zoroastrians in Qajar, Iran, where they suffered hardcore persecution and marginalization at the level more severe than usual under the last 1,000 plus years of Islamic rulers. Motivated by a strong sense of religious solidarity and shared heritage, prominent Parsi philanthropists, led most notably by Manekji Limji Hatari, and his Persian Zoroastrian Amelioration Fund spearheaded humanitarian and independent diplomatic missions to Iran. There, they tirelessly advocated for legal reforms, education, and improved living conditions for Iranian Zoroastrians. These efforts led to the lifting of the jizya tax, the establishment of Zoroastrian schools, and the development of community institutions that fostered pride and resilience, not to mention the loosening of discriminatory laws and regulations. However, with all of these power plays and shifts in fortune, Zoroastrians in India and Iran suffered greatly in one particular category: education about the Zoroastrian faith. Very few Zoroastrians knew about their own theologies and practices. Avesta had lost all meaning beyond ritual repetition, and due to the arrival of British missionaries and European Orientalists, new interpretations of the faith began developing as Zoroastrians became more and more educated about their own religion. This led to the rise of two major theological movements, beginning in Bombay and spreading to the rest of the Zoroastrian global community. The popularity of Protestantized interpretations, such as those of the scholar Martin Hogg, led to the development of the Reformist movement, which critiqued the need for constant ritualization, called for a more philosophical and rationalist understanding of the religion, advocated for more inclusion of women and converts, and reconceptualized the Zoroastrian cosmology along more monotheistic lines. Meanwhile, with the establishment and influence of the Theosophists in Bombay, a counter-reform traditionalist movement, informed by Western esotericism and a desire to double down on exactly the critiques the reformists had, along with centering ethnic supremacy and blood purity, developed. While reformism holds major sway in Iran, Kurdistan, and the global Zoroastrian diaspora, traditionalism remains the main ideological power core in Indian Zoroastrianism. It must be noted that there are other smaller yet growing movements, most notably revivalism, which seeks to transcend the ideological binary, and as Zoroastrianism grows by leaps and bounds in the diaspora through movement and conversion, particularly in North America, the intermixing of these movements and generational disgruntlement has led to a decline of factional affiliation outside of India. As traditional centers of Zoroastrian life, most notably India, faced demographic decline due to low birth rates, intermarriage debates, and emigration, and while Iranian Zoroastrians once again suffer under an oppressive regime, the diaspora has become a focal point for cultural preservation, social innovation, and religious renewal. Despite being less than 100,000 worldwide, Zoroastrians in various fields have made a name for themselves internationally. The most famous modern Zoroastrian is no doubt Freddie Mercury, of the legendary rock band Queen, who was born Farrokh Bulsara to Parsi parents in Zanzibar. One of the most remarkable developments in recent years is the revival of Zoroastrianism amongst the Kurds, particularly in the Kurdish regions of Iraq and Syria, where the faith is increasingly embraced as a symbol of pre-Islamic heritage and ethnic identity tied to a revolutionary nationalistic fervor. This resurgence has led to the official recognition of Zoroastrianism by the Kurdish regional government and the autonomous government in Rojava, and the re-establishment of fire temples and community centers after over 1,000 years. Concurrently, due to the work of organizations such as Fazana and others, there's been a modest but notable rise in conversions to Zoroastrianism in the upper Western world due to the welcoming atmosphere provided. We'll be diving deeper into what modern Zoroastrianism is like in our final episode, so stay with us until then to learn more. With that, we've explored the vast history of Zoroastrianism over the last few episodes, before Zarathustra, during Zarathustra, and after Zarathustra, and now here we are. Thank you for joining us on this fourth episode of Zoroastrianism 101. We hope it has been informative, entertaining, and insightful in a multiplicity of ways. In the next episode, we take a look at the Zoroastrian literary canon, how notions of scripture and canonicity differ for Zoroastrians, and how these texts are used, studied, and approached. Thank you again for 1,000 subscribers, as without you, our awesome audience, none of this would be possible. If you can, please support us by donating at the link provided in the description. See you next episode.